Margaret had always believed that a mother's love was enough to keep the family together. At 75, she fondly remembered when her children, Thomas, Emma, and David, would run around the house, filling her heart with joy. But now, the house was silent. Her days were filled with the echoes of old laughter, while her grown children, busy and distant, seemed to have forgotten the promises of care and affection they once made. Margaret tried to justify their absence, telling herself they were busy with life. But deep down, she knew the bond she treasured was slowly unraveling. As time went on, Margaret began to notice the signs of abandonment. The visits became rare, and when her children did visit, it was always in a rush, talking about work, personal problems, or plans for the future. But these plans never included her. Even as she struggled with simple tasks, like climbing stairs or remembering to take her medication, Thomas, Emma, and David showed little concern. They were more interested in discussing her finances, managing the house, and what to do with their mother's money. One day, after a long absence from any of her children, Margaret received an unexpected visit. Thomas, with a serious look, announced that he, along with Emma and David, had decided it would be best to place her in a nursing home. "It'll be easier for you, Mom. You'll get all the care you need there," he said, avoiding her eyes. Margaret felt her heart sink. It wasn't care they wanted to provide, it was convenience. She, who had spent her life caring for them, was now seen as a burden to be discarded. That night, sitting alone in her favorite chair, Margaret cried quietly. She knew she was losing something far more precious than her independence. She was losing her children. The weeks that followed were tough for Margaret. The phone calls became rare and brief, always filled with excuses about pressing commitments. Thomas, who claimed to be the responsible one, took control of Margaret's finances, saying that in her old age, she might get confused with the numbers. He assured her it was all for her own good, but what Margaret didn't know was that her children were using her money to fund their own indulgences. Emma constantly talked about remodeling her house, and David mentioned an expensive trip, but the money they spent wasn't theirs. When she called to ask for help with small tasks, like a trip to the doctor or the pharmacy, they always had an excuse. "Mom, I'd love to, but I'm swamped with work today," Emma would say hastily. David simply ignored the calls. Each unanswered request felt like another layer of loneliness settling over Margaret's heart. Time passed, and the isolation became suffocating. Margaret's health started to decline. She could barely take care of herself, and the small signs of forgetfulness grew more frequent. But to her children, this was just another reason to put her in a home. "At least there, you'll have someone to take care of you," Thomas said during one of his rare visits, his gaze avoiding hers. The motherly love Margaret had always given now seemed like something her children didn't know how to return. When the final decision was made, Margaret didn't resist. She knew fighting wouldn't change anything. The weight of abandonment from her children was already too heavy to bear. Deep down, Margaret just wanted a little peace, even if that peace came from strangers. And so, without fuss and without the love she longed for, she was taken to the nursing home. Once again, she found herself alone. Yet, something inside her told her this story was far from over. That morning marked a turning point for Margaret. Thomas and Emma arrived with distant looks, carrying bags and documents that made official what she had feared for weeks. "It's for the best, Mom," they said, their voices emotionless, almost mechanical. They took her to the nursing home without ceremony, without honest conversations, without the dignity she deserved. As the car drove down the road, Margaret looked out the window, feeling each mile as a bitter farewell to the life she had built. Upon arriving, the impact was immediate. The reception area of the nursing home was cold, the faces of the staff trying, in vain, to hide the melancholy that filled the place. Margaret barely had time to absorb it all before Thomas and Emma said their quick goodbyes. "We'll be back soon," they promised, but the emptiness in their words revealed that soon would never come. As the door closed behind them, Margaret felt the weight of her new reality. Abandoned, alone, and left with strangers. without even her personal belongings. The first nights in the nursing home were the hardest. Margaret could barely sleep. The pillow was unfamiliar, the atmosphere too quiet, and the absence of her children cut like a knife in her chest. Without proper medication, without the familiar objects that brought some comfort, she found herself suffocated by the pain of loneliness. No one asked about her. No one brought a gift or a token of affection. The silence from her children was deafening. It was as if she had vanished from their world. There were moments when Margaret found herself wondering what she had done wrong. How had she raised children who, in the end, abandoned her without even looking back? But between the tears and the pain, something inside her still held on. Yes, there was an immense void, but also a faint flame of dignity. Margaret wouldn't be a victim forever. She knew that somehow her story wasn't over yet. A few days after being left at the nursing home, Margaret received an unexpected visit. Her 3 children, Thomas, Emma, and David, appeared together, something that hadn't happened in a long time. For a brief moment, Margaret's heart leaped with hope. Had they reconsidered? Had they finally understood that the home, the place she had built with so much love, could still be her place? But that hope was quickly crushed by Thomas's first words. "We came to talk about the house, Mom," he began bluntly. "We've decided it's better to sell it. The money will be well invested, and you won't have to worry anymore." Margaret felt a chill down her spine. The house she had turned into a home, where she had raised each of her children with so much care, was now being treated as a financial asset, a disposable object. She tried to protest, her voice weak, almost pleading. "But what if I come back one day? The house, maybe you'll change your mind and take me back." Emma sighed impatiently. "Mom, you know you can't live alone anymore. The nursing home is the best place for you now. The house doesn't make sense anymore." The words fell on Margaret like a sentence. There was no more room for her in the life that had once been hers. There was no choice. Even though it went against her wishes, Margaret knew she was at her children's mercy. Without saying anything else, she took the pen Thomas handed her and signed the papers to sell the house. The next day, the children returned to the nursing home with bags of new clothes. "Here, Mom, we bought some clothes for you," said David, as if that could make up for the emptiness they had left. Margaret thanked them, with a lump in her throat. They were there, yes, but not really. Their visits were not out of affection. They were quick, cold transactions, almost without emotion. After handing over the clothes, they divided the rest of the money from the house sale among themselves, chatting about investments and future plans. But for Margaret, the future seemed increasingly bleak and lonely. The visits, which were already rare, became almost non-existent. Margaret spent days and weeks waiting for a phone call, a small reminder that she still mattered. But the phone didn't ring, and the doors of the nursing home didn't open for them. With each absence, her sadness deepened, and what remained of hope began to fade. She no longer had a home to return to. Her children had taken everything from her, leaving only the silence and memories of a love that seemed to have never existed. As the weeks went by, the reality of abandonment settled deep within Margaret. Her children, now almost absent, seemed to have erased any trace of empathy and care. The void left by their increasingly rare visits only grew. But surprisingly, the nursing home began to become something more than an emotional prison for her. The care and solidarity of the people around her began to soften her pain. The nursing home staff, sensing Margaret's silent suffering, were always ready to offer a smile, a word of comfort. They brought her the medication she was missing, helped her with the small tasks her children neglected, and little by little, Margaret began to feel a comfort she hadn't imagined finding there. The nights, once lonely and filled with tears, became less heavy. The conversations around the dinner table, the laughter shared with the other elderly residents, began to fill the gaps her children had left behind. Margaret became friends with Doris, a cheerful and spirited woman who had been at the nursing home for a few years. Doris shared funny stories from her youth and showed Margaret that even there, life could still be full of small pleasures. Every day, Margaret found in Doris and the other residents a strength she thought she had lost. She discovered that care could come from unexpected places, from people who, although not her family, genuinely cared about her. The nursing home, which had once seemed like the symbol of her abandonment, now became a warm home. And ironically, it was there that Margaret found a new kind of family, made up of people who, like her, had been cast aside by the ones they loved. Over time, she began to let go of the hope that her children would return with genuine love. Instead, she focused on the present, accepting the love and friendship she found in the home. Yet, there was still a lingering pain Margaret carried. She knew that a true reconciliation with her children would never come. But now, she was beginning to accept that perhaps that was their choice, not hers. And little by little, she began to prepare for a future different from the one she had imagined. Months had passed since Margaret began to feel more at peace in the nursing home. The friendships she had made brought her a comfort she never expected to find there. The lively conversations with Doris and the staff at the home helped her rediscover a quiet joy, far from the shadow of her children's abandonment. But on an ordinary morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at the home, bringing with him a twist Margaret could never have imagined. A well-dressed man, with a polished British accent, walked through the door of the nursing home's common room. He carried a leather briefcase and, after introducing himself, asked to speak with Margaret in private. Intrigued and a bit apprehensive, she followed him to a small room reserved for conversations. "My name is Mr. Harrison," the man said with a polite smile, sitting across from her. "I'm your family's attorney in England. I'm here with important news about an inheritance you've just received." Margaret was surprised, not understanding at first. Mr. Harrison continued, explaining that a distant relative, whom she barely remembered, had passed away and left her a large sum of money. The inheritance was significant, enough money to change her life and, ironically, her children's lives as well. The shock of receiving such news left her stunned for a moment. She had never expected anything like this, especially at this stage in her life, but something inside her told her that this twist would bring more than just financial relief. In the days following the lawyer's visit, Margaret knew her children would soon find out. It didn't take long. Just a week after Mr. Harrison's visit, Thomas, Emma, and David showed up unexpectedly at the nursing home after months of no contact. Each of their smiles was fake, as if they were pretending to show a concern that didn't exist. "Mom, how are you? We want to spend more time with you," said Emma, trying to sound convincing, but Margaret knew that rehearsed sweetness. Thomas got straight to the point. "Mom, we heard you're going to receive an inheritance," he said, his tone barely concealing his anxiety. "We want to help you manage that money so nothing goes wrong." Margaret watched them in silence, recognizing the same interest in money that she had seen so many times before in their faces. They were back, but not out of love. This time, it was because of something they could take from her. But now Margaret was ready. She smiled slightly, nodded, and let them believe they were in control. But in her heart, a decision had already been made, and she would be the one responsible for her destiny. After Mr. Harrison's visit, Margaret felt for the first time in a long while that she had control over her life. As her children tried to reconnect, pretending to care and attempting to manipulate her for access to the inheritance, she quietly worked with a lawyer on something much bigger. With his help, she managed to withdraw part of the money and did something that truly warmed her heart. She decided to invest in the nursing home that had taken her in when no one else would. Margaret's first project was to revitalize the garden, which had previously been just a modest, lifeless area. With her investment, the space soon transformed into an enchanting retreat, full of flowers, fruit trees, and cozy benches where the home's residents could rest and chat. Margaret loved strolling through the garden, and the smiles of the other residents, who now had a beautiful place to spend their days, filled her with joy. Each flower planted, each tree that grew, was a reminder that she still had the power to make decisions, to leave something good in the world. But it didn't stop there. Margaret also helped modernize some areas of the nursing home, ensuring that the elderly received better care and had access to new resources and activities. She knew how much small gestures could make a difference, as she had experienced firsthand. The staff, touched by Margaret's generosity, treated her with even more kindness. She was now not just a resident, but someone who was changing the lives of everyone there. Meanwhile, Thomas, Emma, and David continued their increasingly frequent visits. They had no idea what Margaret was doing with the money and believed she was keeping it all, waiting to pass it on to them. During conversations, they tried to convince her to leave the inheritance in their hands, saying she was too old to worry about such things and that they would take care of everything. Margaret, however, listened patiently, smiling and agreeing, but never revealing her true plans. She knew her children were blinded by money, and every word they said only reinforced her decision. Margaret continued to live in peace, knowing that at the end of her life, she would do what was right for those who had truly welcomed and cared for her in her final years. However, each day that passed brought her closer to the final decision. The will was made. The months that followed brought a change in Thomas, Emma, and David's behavior. Knowing about the inheritance and imagining that they would soon have access to it, they started visiting Margaret more often. They arrived at the nursing home with gifts, forced smiles, and rehearsed words of affection. Margaret observed each gesture calmly, now familiar with the act they were putting on. She knew that behind every visit, there was no genuine affection, only the greed for the fortune they believed was guaranteed. "You look great, Mom," Emma would say, holding her hand in a way she had never done before. "We're so happy to see you like this." Margaret smiled politely, thanking her, but the emptiness in Emma's words was obvious. Her children were trying to project an image of concern and love, but Margaret knew it was just a mask. She wondered if any of them truly felt remorse for abandoning her. Thomas, always the most direct, suggested more than once that Margaret should transfer the inheritance money to them since it didn't make sense for her to handle it all alone. "We can make sure this money is well invested, Mom," he insisted. David, who rarely visited before, now tried to appear more present, offering help with small things at the home, but never really engaging in true care. Each of them acted as if their closeness was natural, but Margaret saw through the illusion. The garden at the nursing home, which Margaret had helped transform, became her place of peace. While her children were busy trying to manipulate the situation, Margaret walked among the flowers she had helped plant, chatted with the other residents, and reflected on how life had led her to that moment. The nursing home, which she had initially feared, was now her refuge, and the people there, the true friends she had made, were the ones who embraced her with sincerity. She knew the moment of revelation was near. Her children were confident that everything was under control, but they couldn't have been more wrong. Every time Margaret looked at them, she saw the emotional distance that still existed, even with their false attempts to reconnect. The true family she had found was made up of the people who had cared for her when she needed it most. Years went by, and the nursing home, which had once been just a temporary residence for Margaret, became her true home. She knew that with the fortune she had, she could easily leave, buy a house, and hire staff to take care of her needs. But that wasn't what her heart wanted. In the nursing home, Margaret had found something money couldn't buy: genuine friendships, true care, and a community that made her feel loved every day. She was never alone. For the first time since her children abandoned her, she didn't miss the life she had left behind. With the inheritance money, Margaret turned the nursing home into a place of celebration and life. She funded new activities, art workshops, theme parties, and even musical concerts for the residents. The garden, which was already one of her greatest joys, blossomed even more, becoming a daily gathering spot for the elderly who, like her, had been left behind by their families. Margaret found happiness in seeing smiles everywhere, in knowing that her generosity brought comfort to those who needed it most. The nursing home, once a place of loneliness, was now a vibrant center, full of laughter and shared stories. Her children, Thomas, Emma, and David, never stopped showing up, always pretending to be concerned about their mother. Deep down, though, They were obsessed with the idea that Margaret was spending too much on the home and that this would affect the money they believed they would one day inherit. "Mom, you're using too much of that money on the home. We should manage your assets better," Thomas insisted, trying to hide his frustration. Margaret listened patiently, but every word carried a bitter weight in her heart. "You took the money from the sale of my house and never did anything for me here," she would respond, her voice always calm, but full of pain. It was a truth her children never admitted, but Margaret knew that money had disappeared into the luxuries of their lives. What remained of her fortune, they hoped would be theirs as well. Margaret suffered in silence, watching what her children had become, people blinded by greed, incapable of understanding the value of love and family. As time went on, Margaret began to feel the signs of old age weighing on her. Her health worsened, and she knew the end was near. Weakness set in, and the nursing home doctors, always attentive, had already prepared the staff to give her the best care possible in her final days. Her children, though not openly wishing for her death, were becoming increasingly anxious to know how the money would be divided. The fights among them became frequent, each trying to secure their share. In the moment she spent alone in her room, Margaret allowed herself to reflect. She had no regrets about her decision. She knew that true wealth lay in the love and compassion she had cultivated at the nursing home. Her children, though they still occupied a place in her heart, had lost the right to claim anything beyond that. She felt at peace. The will was made, and she knew that soon everything would be revealed. When Margaret passed away, the nursing home was filled with genuine sadness. Every resident, every staff member, felt the loss of a woman who had touched so many lives with her generosity and kindness. For many, Margaret was not just a friend, but a true matriarch, someone who brought light to a place once marked by loneliness. The garden she loved so much was in full bloom, a reflection of the impact she had left behind. The peace Margaret found in her final years was evident in her serene face on the day of her passing. But while the nursing home united in mourning and celebrating Margaret's life, her children, Thomas, Emma, and David, were focused on another matter, the will. After the funeral, which they attended with little emotion, Margaret's lawyer, Mr. Harrison, called a meeting for the reading of the will. For Thomas, Emma, and David, this was the moment they had been waiting for years. Anxiously, they sat in chairs around the meeting table, each trying to hide their nervousness but letting greedy glances slip. The recent fights between them over how the money would be divided no longer seemed to matter. They were about to find out the truth. When Mr. Harrison began reading the will, the silence in the room was almost unbearable. Margaret had left a clear message. "To my children," began the letter she had written in her own hand. "You took the money from the sale of the house I loved and gave me nothing in return but indifference. Over the years, I watched as you pretended to care, only to ensure a piece of what you believed was your right. But the true value of love, compassion, and care is not in money. It's in the people who surround us when we need it most." Thomas looked at the lawyer, uneasy. "What does that mean?" he murmured. Emma began fidgeting with her fingers, nervous. David, always the most impatient, crossed his arms, waiting to hear about the money. Mr. Harrison continued, his voice firm but respectful. "For this reason, I leave my entire inheritance to the nursing home that gave me love and care in my final days of life. I leave this money to improve the lives of those who, like me, were abandoned but found a new family. As for you, my children, know that I loved you, but love cannot be bought with money." The shock was immediate. Thomas froze, unsure of what to say. Emma began to cry, but her tears were out of frustration, not sadness. David, furious, stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. She couldn't do that. But Margaret's decision was irreversible. The entire fortune, the money her children had so coveted, would go to the nursing home. Their outrage was pointless. As they argued and blamed each other, the lawyer watched in silence. Margaret had foreseen all of this, and now, wherever she was, she had left her final mark. She wouldn't be remembered for the fortune she left to her children, but for the lasting impact her generosity would have on those who needed it most. In honor of its greatest benefactor, the nursing home held a ceremony to honor Margaret. The garden, which was flourishing like never before, was renamed in her memory. Margaret passed away in peace, knowing that in the end, she did what was right. And although her children would never understand the true lesson she left them, Margaret's legacy would live on in the hearts of everyone who crossed paths with that nursing home, the true home she helped build. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And be sure to check out one of the recommended videos on the screen right now. I'm sure you'll love it too.